Hey everybody. For a long time, I've been meaning to do a video about my time spent as a mental health technician at an inpatient psychiatric hospital. And I'm finally getting around to making a video that talks about my experience so that if you're interested in that career, you can see what it's like before you actually get into it. On the side panel here, I'm going to show you the different subjects I'm going to be discussing and also the time stamp when those subjects are started to be discussed. So if there's something you want to jump around to, by all means, feel free to jump ahead. So anyway, so what is it like to be a mental health technician at an inpatient psychiatric hospital? Well, mental health technician can be used as other terms as well, such as a patient caregiver or maybe just a patient assistant. Hospitals have different names for the same position, but in general, what a mental health technician does is a mental health technician at an inpatient psychiatric hospital works one-on-one or in groups with patients that are staying in the psychiatric hospital to help them rehabilitate and get back on their feet and hopefully get back home to their regular lives. Now, every hospital is different, the way they run things, so the duties of a mental health technician might vary from one hospital to the next. And there's a lot of things that go into that, such as whether the hospital is a for-profit hospital or whether the hospital is a non-profit, whether it's state or government run. All those things can affect the job functions of a mental health technician. But in this video, when I talk about the duties, I'm going to talk about the general duties that I did, and I think that they're duties that are largely shared across different hospitals for mental health technicians. In addition, there are certain state regulations and state norms that might vary from state to state here in America. I'm in South Carolina. I was working here in Charleston at an inpatient psychiatric hospital. And here in South Carolina, you don't need to be certified as a mental health technician in order to work as a mental health technician. Other states, that's different. I know, for example, in California, I don't know if it's a requirement that you have a certification for mental health technician, but I know that hospitals largely only hire people who are certified. So it can vary from state to state. Here in South Carolina, I just had a college degree, and it was a college degree in liberal arts. I went to school for political science. So where I live, then it just generally based on having a general understanding of psychology, a desire to work in mental health, and some sort of qualifications in terms of education that show that you are going to be a good employee for the hospital. So let's talk a little bit about the application process. All I did was apply for an open position, and I was interviewed. And when I was interviewed, I was given a list of questions that I need, basically like a test, that I needed to answer a certain percentage correct in order to be considered for the job. And those questions were largely based on situations of what I should do with certain patients, questions about psychology, just general understanding of mental health. And I have a good background of, I'm not a licensed mental health professional, but I have a long-standing background of independent study about mental illness, mental health, all sorts of things across the board. So given that, I was able to do well enough on the test. I don't know how many I got right, but I did well enough on the test that I met their requirements. So I was then obviously given the opportunity to work for the hospital. So that's another thing to keep in mind as well. You need to have some sort of baseline background. If you don't have a degree in psychology or a degree in something related to psychology, you need to have some sort of baseline experience that shows that you're good with working with people, you have a desire to work in mental health, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So let's talk about what happened when I was first hired. First of all, when you're hired, there's a very intensive training process, which makes a lot of sense. Because when you're working as a mental health technician, in a lot of ways, people's lives are in your hands. Literally, people's lives are in your hands. You could be the person that prevents someone from killing themselves or hurting someone else. So bearing that in mind, there is a lot of training that they give you when you first get hired. A lot of that training has to do with de-escalating patients. What that means is when someone's really hyped up, emotional, angry, maybe self-destructive, they teach you methods of how you can talk that person down and how you can sort of calm them down and then help everyone else around them be safe. So isolate the person, keep them away from other people, from harming themselves and other people, and different things you can say and do to prevent the person from getting even more amped up, more agitated, more dangerous. In addition, you also are trained how to restrain someone with your hands when someone is acting out in a way that is potentially dangerous or destructive for themselves or others. So working in a psychiatric hospital, you're going to be working with patients who are experiencing hallucinations, serious delusions, and psychosis. That's going to be a large section of the hospital is just geared towards individuals experiencing those episodes. And what that means is that someone who's experiencing psychosis has a hard time determining what is real and what is not real. And they might believe that you're trying to kill them, for example, that you're an assassin sent to kill them. And I'll get into some interesting stories that I experienced as a mental health technician that'll help sort of explain that a little better. But if a patient thinks that you're trying to kill them, they might then attack you. They might physically attack you. And you have to know, as an employee at the hospital, how to restrain the person without hurting them. Because the last thing you want to do is you don't want to punish someone physically for something that they're not mentally capable of making sound decisions in the first place. So the training you go through is training that helps you to work with your coworkers, work with the team to help restrain someone physically without hurting them, so that if they're ever in a situation where they're trying to hurt themselves or someone else, you can prevent them from doing that. And is it common that people get held down? It depends on the unit you're working in. If you're working in the psychosis and hallucinations unit, then, I mean, you might be needed for a hold once every day or once every other day. If you're working with the adult unit, just individuals experiencing addiction, anxiety, depression, holds are much more rare. It's very rare that you have to hold someone down. Usually all the restraints that are done at a hospital are done with the patients who are experiencing psychosis and hallucinations. All right, so let's talk about just the day in the life. What does a typical day entail as a mental health technician? First, when you arrive to work, the first thing you do is you listen to a recap of the previous shift, what happened on the previous shift, and what patients you'll be working with that day. So the nurses typically tend to make either on videotape or just verbally when you're in the room. They will give you a highlight of all the things they experienced in the last few hours in their shift, and they will give you an overview of every patient you're working with and all their diagnoses and things you need to keep in mind. So, for example, when you're working on the adult unit, they'll say, this is Jim, he's 25 years old, he just tried to kill himself the other day because he lost his job and he has a history of depression. He had a good day today, he's very cooperative, very friendly, so you shouldn't have any issues. It's things like that, like a very quick breakdown. And also, the nurse will also give you any dietary restrictions they might have or any procedural restrictions they might have. Because depending on the hospital, depending on the patient, depending on the unit, patients are given time outside, for example, like it may be like in the courtyard or just activity time outside. And if someone's on good behavior and someone's capable of making quality decisions, then they'll be cleared by the psychiatrist to go outside. And if someone's being uncooperative, combative, and they're a flight risk, in other words, if they're a danger that they might run away if they go outside, then they're held in the unit. So the nurse will give you all that information when you first get to the shift that day about who's not allowed outside, who's following a special diet, all that kind of stuff. There's a psychiatrist that is on call and on duty basically 24 hours a day. By and large, all the psychiatrist visits, the psychiatrists that work at the hospital, they're the MDs, the medical doctors that are specialized in psychiatry. They see all the patients typically in the morning. They meet with the psychiatrists meet with every single patient in the hospital every single day to check on their medications, see if there's anything else they need to do for their therapeutic interventions. And the psychiatrists do their rounds in the morning. So if you work in the morning, you might see the psychiatrist walking around from patient to patient and doing interviews and talking to them. If you work in the afternoon or evening shift, though, you might never even see the psychiatrist. I worked in the evening shift, and we only ever saw the psychiatrist when someone needed to get medication and someone needed a very serious intervention of some kind. That's the only time that we ever saw the psychiatrist working on the evening shift. So something else to keep in mind. So once you get to work, once you listen to the recording of what's been going on in the unit that day, or you get the verbal from the nurse about what's been going on, the first thing you do is you do inspections of the floor of the hospital unit. So bear in mind, the hospital unit that you're going to be working in it's an enclosed wing of a hospital, and it typically has anywhere from 8 to 15, maybe 20 patients in each unit. And all the doors are locked. So when you're working there, you're locked in with the patients. Of course, you have a badge and you have a key. You can leave at any time, hypothetically speaking. But you are locked in with the patients into the wing of the hospital. So the first thing you do is you need to do an inspection of all the rooms. Because every single shift, you need to make sure that no one has taken some sort of contraband that they're using and turning into a weapon so they can hurt themselves or hurt someone else. You need to make sure they don't have anything dangerous in their rooms, they might have found on the ground, or they might have had a visitor sneak in, which is another thing that sometimes happens. Visitors might sneak in certain banned items for their friends or family members who are in the hospital. So you need to do an inspection of every room, and basically every square inch of the hospital you need to go and just do a quick search to make sure there's nothing dangerous in anyone's rooms or in the common area. After that happens, basically you start like organizing the day. There's usually a specific criteria of all the things that you're going to be doing that day, the schedule that, there's a certain schedule for every day of the week, and at every single moment in a given day, there's an outline of what the patient should be doing at that time. Might be like a group therapy time, might be lunchtime, dinner time, might be activity time, might be free time. The whole day will be delineated into different 15 or 30-minute segments. So you'll have to follow the schedule and follow the itinerary for the day. And so, for example, if there's a group discussion, usually that's led by the therapists, the like social workers, the licensed therapists who are on duty at the hospital. But there's also group discussions that are led by the mental health technicians. So one thing you might be doing as a mental health technician is you might be leading discussion groups, educational groups, just sort of like activity groups. So one thing as a mental health technician is you'll need to be okay with being in the spotlight. You'll need to be okay with sitting in the circle with all the patients and having them all looking at you, waiting for you to give direction and waiting for you to sort of lead things. So that's another thing to be aware of. You take the patients to lunch, to dinner, breakfast, whatever it might be, depending on whatever shift you work on. Now, a major consistent duty for your entire time that you'll be working in your shift, you need to be on a regular basis making note of the safety of all patients on the unit. So bear in mind that patients who come to a psychiatric hospital, they come there because they either just tried to kill themselves, or they've made some sort of notice that they are wanting to kill themselves or wanting to kill someone else, or they're experiencing delusions, hallucinations, and psychosis, which makes them mentally and legally unable to make sound, rational decisions. So in other words, the people that you're going to be working with are people who their decision-making is not the best at the time. And the number one duty of the hospital is to make sure that every patient who walks in there walks out at some point. The last thing the hospital wants is for someone to kill themselves or kill someone else while they're staying at the hospital. So as a mental health technician, your number one duty is going to be logging on a regular basis that you've seen someone, each patient in your care, that you've seen that they're being safe and that they're not doing anything harmful, and you make a note of what they're doing. That is a consistent basis throughout the entire shift. So what I mean is that each hospital has different regulations in regards to how often you need to be checking someone's safety, but by and large, it's no more than every 15 minutes. You need to see the person, and you need to mark down what they're doing and make sure that they're not doing anything dangerous. Make sure that they're not getting angry or upset about something. Make sure that they don't look like they're about to do something destructive. Every hospital is different, but by and large, it's every 10 or 15 minutes you need to be doing that. That is a very exhaustive task, because it's almost like the entire day you're just walking around going, okay, there's Steve, he's okay, there's Bob, okay, there's Cheryl, okay. Like the entire day you're walking around the clipboard basically noting everyone's safety, making sure everyone is being visible. Now, you might be asking yourself, well, how does that work? Like, what do you mean by seeing everybody? You need to find every patient in the unit, wherever they are, whether they're in their room, whether they're in the day room watching TV, you need to find them and see them and make sure that they're safe. So that might mean, and that consistently means, knocking on their door when they're in the room and saying, hey, I need to do a safety check, and then you swing the door open and you look at them. You need to physically look at them and take note of, like, okay, maybe they're like sleeping on the bed, or maybe they're just walking around the room talking to themselves, and then you go walk away from the door then. So that is something that is, I would say it's very awkward. And I say it's awkward because imagine for 4 hours straight, every 15 minutes, you go and knock on someone's door and say, hey, Jim, how you doing? Okay, you doing good? Okay, good. And you walk away. So that's one thing. Secondly, if you work during the evening or nighttime when it's dark outside, that means that if someone's sleeping, it's not that you stop doing safety checks and you say, oh, they're sleeping, everything's fine. No. That's not how it works. If someone's sleeping, you still have to basically crack their door open, look at them, make sure that they're safe, and then leave again. So it's a very awkward situation because, again, you're constantly checking in on them, and if they're sleeping, you're constantly checking to make sure they're breathing and making sure that they don't look like they're doing anything dangerous potentially. Because you have to keep in mind, again, most of the people you're working with are going to be people who were recently suicidal or they're actively suicidal, which means that they might be planning how to kill themselves while they're in the hospital. So you need to be checking and being very vigilant about what they're doing at the time. So it sets up a very odd dynamic, because some patients who are experiencing hallucinations might be walking around the room talking to themselves, and you need to go to the room and check on them. And there's only one person in the room, and then they're the only person in the room, but they're having a conversation out loud. And in the middle of the night, perhaps in the middle of the night, and you need to knock on the door and check in on them and make sure that they're okay. And that's something right there that is very sort of odd and frightening, that might scare away a lot of people from the job, just because it's so odd. It's just such an odd thing that, imagine walking up to someone's room, there's one person in the room and they're having a full conversation out loud. You knock on the door and you look in there, they stop talking and stare at you for 5 seconds, and you say just checking in, whatever, and then sort of bring the door a little close again, and they start talking to themselves again. So again, this job is not for everybody, because there are many things that are potentially they just feel awkward, and they're not like any other job you'll ever have in your entire life. So safety inspection is very important. I covered that. You also have to make sure the unit's clean. If there's visiting hours, you need to facilitate the visiting hours. You need to let people in. You need to direct the visitors to the patients. You need to constantly be walking around to sort of just keep an ear open to the conversation, to make sure that no one's getting riled up, that no one's talking about anything that is potentially explicit or potentially just unnecessary. For a somewhat common thing that occurs is you'll have the boyfriend or girlfriend of someone in the hospital come in, and they'll just be talking out loud about how they want to get in bed with each other and stuff like that. They just have they just have complete disregard for the fact that their conversation is completely not appropriate for the situation. And you have to walk over and say, I understand that you miss each other, but you can't discuss this in the group at the time. So you're constantly, in a lot of ways, you're constantly redirecting people's bad behavior to make sure that things don't get out of hand, and make sure that people don't get riled up, and that you sort of keep control of the unit. So let's talk about that for a second. Let's talk about redirection. That's a word that's used a lot in a psychiatric hospital, just in the mental health field with patients. To redirect basically means to make notice of someone's behavior, make them aware of the behavior and why it's not appropriate, and then sort of take their energy and focus it on something that is appropriate. So if you see someone across the room who, again, you're in a psychiatric hospital, anything's possible. They might just, take certain body parts out and, start touching themselves. You need to walk over to them and say, excuse me, that's not appropriate. Please put your pants back on, or please do this or that. Please go to your room so that you can not upset other people. You have to have these constant conversations, and sometimes it feels like you're talking to children, and that's not to demean or to look down upon the patients themselves. But the fact remains that in some basis, their psychiatric functioning might be at the moment that of a child. So if someone's experiencing psychosis, they might be doing things that a child might do. And that's just an expectation that you'll have to be prepared to redirect that person's behavior into something that's productive and positive. Another thing that happens a lot is there's a lot of dynamics about the patients in the hospital. You'll see that some patients form cliques, and you'll want to prevent certain groups of people from trying to run the unit, so to speak. I hate to say this, but it is sort of like a prison, because there are times when patients might form a clique, and they're sort of the in crowd, and everyone else is on the outside, including the staff, and that in crowd will try to get the staff working against each other. They'll try to get the patients working for them. It's a hard to explain, but it happens. And your responsibility as a mental health technician is to notice those kinds of unnecessary interactions and those sort of potentially upsetting sort of group dynamics, and to try to sort of break them open and prevent them from happening. So that might involve, if you see like a group of people like starting to get really close where they're starting to tune out the staff and they're starting to turn against the rest of the patients, you need to like maybe have an activity where everyone has to break up into like different groups and have conversations. Like that gets everyone sort of, that group broken up, and everyone's like starting to like get to know each other a little better. So there's a lot of like little like psychological things that go into that. So that's something to be prepared for. Another thing that you're going to want, another tool or tip that you're going to want to have, is you're going to want to have a good knowledge of the causes and the treatments of all different kinds of major psychiatric illnesses. I'm talking about schizophrenia, schizoaffective disorder, bipolar type 1 and 2, also bipolar mania, manic episodes, depression, anxiety, OCD, and addiction. I would say those are really the main ones you're going to want to know. And the reason I say this is because every patient you work with, you're going to know their diagnosis. Like ahead of time, you'll know what they're there for, like what led to them being there, and you'll know what treatment they're getting in terms of medication or in terms of therapy. And knowing what illness they have helps you to have productive communication with them. So for example, if you're working with someone who has schizophrenia, and they are experiencing extreme delusions that they're trying to be silenced by the government, and the government's trying to keep them down, you will know when you talk to them not to say anything that sounds conspiratorial, not to make jokes or say anything that might cause them to feed that into their delusion. So for example, like it's common in our everyday lives to say, like, oh, all the government's collecting all my emails, or like, the government's, they have my text messages, that the NSA is listening to our conversation. Like we know that the government, for example, has data collection measures. But you don't want to ever say anything about that, related to that, to someone who's experiencing a delusion that the government's after them, because that they're gonna have concrete thinking about that, and it's gonna feed into their delusion. They're gonna say, aha, I knew it, I was right. And I have another video about how to talk to delusional people, which I will leave the link below so that you can sort of get a little more insight into that. But you have to be prepared to have a significant amount of mental health education, so that when you talk to people who have certain illnesses, you'll know why they do what they do, and you'll know how to talk to them in a way that is effective in terms of their communication. So in terms of routine, last but not least, if you work in the morning shift, you're going to be basically getting them up in the morning, and then in the afternoon you're going to leave them with the evening crowd. If you're working the evening crowd, you're going to pick up and then from where the day shift left off, and you're going to end your shift pretty much like getting everyone to go to sleep at night, which isn't always easy, especially if you're working with if there's any teenagers or kids that you're working with in the kids unit, if there is one. And then the night shift is essentially just making sure everyone is healthy, making sure everyone's breathing, and making sure that no one is in their bed at night figuring out ways to kill themselves. And patients can try to kill themselves and can successfully kill themselves with something as small as a staple. They can hang themselves with socks. They can make weapons out of putting an apple into a sock and swinging it around. You name it. So that's why safety is so important. So if you're working the night shift, you're going to basically be making sure that you don't see anything suspicious in the middle of the night where someone might be trying to kill themselves under cover of darkness. And another thing too, when you're doing the checks, if you're working at nighttime, you'll need to potentially shine like a light into the room to make sure you see the person. You can't just assume that the shape of the outline in their bed is them. You have to physically see the person with your own eyes under the light of day on some level. So again, something to keep in mind. So that's sort of like the daily routine. Let's talk about the different units that you'll potentially be working in the psychiatric hospital. First and foremost, almost every single psychiatric hospital is going to have what's called a crisis unit. The crisis unit is going to have people who are experiencing active delusions, active hallucinations, and active psychosis for the most part. So these are people who sometimes you can't even have a conversation with them, because you'll say like, hey Bob, how are you doing today? He'll just be like, spaghetti, strangle me, I hate you. That'll be his response, because like he's having like a word salad as part of like a symptom of schizophrenia. Someone who might be having a delusion or a hallucination, you'll walk up to them and say, oh, do you want to like watch some TV, or do you want to color? And they might be saying, no, there are bugs over there. There are bugs everywhere. Don't you see these bugs? Like, oh my God. And like they'll like start running around trying to get away from bugs that they think that they see. Again, so that's a hallucination. And also, the crisis unit will have people who are experiencing active delusions. I've talked to numerous patients who thought that they were God or some sort of messiah or deity. I've talked to numerous patients who thought that they were sent by God to give a message to the world. I've talked to numerous patients who thought that they were famous celebrities, and they said, "Oh, I have a world tour kicking off next week. I got to be out of this hospital. I'm a well-known rapper. They're like, don't you know me?" So that's where usually the crisis unit is where you house those individuals. And the reason you do that is because you generally want to put all the like-minded people in the same location, because people who are able to think rationally will not work well in an environment where people are running around trying to run away from imaginary bugs and yelling about how the government's trying to kill them. So I'm just thinking about, like, let's say that you have like just a little bit of depression and anxiety, and you consider killing yourself, and you're put into a psychiatric hospital. Do you think that being around a room full of people who are experiencing psychosis is going to help you, or is going to make your life worse? It's going to make your life worse. And that's why all the patients who have psychosis and delusions and hallucinations are put into the same unit. Another thing too is like that usually those units are extra staffed. So you'll never be left alone, like one mental health technician and one nurse. You'll never be like left those two individuals alone with a room full of psychosis patients, because they are the most likely to become volatile. They're the most likely to be needed to be held down if they are becoming escalated, becoming angry. So crisis units, they're designed that way for a reason, and it works. It functionally works. It's unfortunate that everyone that goes into a psychiatric hospital can't have one-on-one alone time with therapeutic staff. That's just way too expensive. No hospital, except for a hospital that charges maybe like 10, 15, 20 grand a day, could ever have any sort of setup like that. It is just too expensive to do. So aside from the crisis unit, what you also have is usually you'll have an adult unit where you're working with patients who have depression and anxiety, who are suicidal or were attempted suicide or were recently suicidal. And those patients might also have a dual diagnosis. They might also have an addiction in addition to their depression and anxiety. So the adult unit is, that was my favorite unit to work on, because it had just everyday people who were able to have a conversation with you and were just going through things in their life that they were having a hard time they were struggling with. They were having a hard time overcoming. When you work in the adult unit, you'll have a lot of patients who were abused, who were assaulted, sexually assaulted, patients who grew up in very tough environments and they have depression throughout their life because of that. Patients who recently experienced traumatic life events and they're having a hard time coping with them. So the adult unit is where I feel like if you want to make a really big impact, that's where you can make a huge impact. Because again, they're people who are, generally speaking, they're of rational mind, so you can talk to them about their issues, and they're looking for a solution to their problems. They're aware they have a problem and they want a solution to it. That's why I love working on the adult unit. That was my favorite thing to do. You'll also sometimes have a detox or an addiction unit. I know that the hospital I worked at had one of those. And I also love the detox and addiction unit. I love working with addicts. They're the most fun, I think, the most fun people to work with. There's the most interesting, like, psychological, issues going on there that you can really make a good positive impact on. The one thing about the addiction detox units, though, that is extremely challenging is that addiction patients have no patience. They have zero patience. If they want something, they think they should have it at that moment. And it makes sense when you consider the fact that addiction is based around someone thinking that they need something to be happy. They go out and get it, and they do it, and then they need to do it again. And then they go out and get it and do it again. So addicts, when they need something, they start scheming about how they can get it. And addiction a lot of time relies on manipulation, coercion, deception in order to continue. Because if you're an addict and you're like maybe like a mother or father, you need to do things to hide the addiction from your family, so you need to be deceptive. You need to do things to convince your husband or wife or kids that what you're doing is normal and that they're the ones with the problem. You need to set up, it's basically like, I always look at it this way, like being an addict and living the life of an addict is like spinning a bunch of plates and trying to keep them all up at the same time. It's just a constant battle to like keep everything like in the air at once. So when you're working with addict patients, they'll come up to you and be like, "Hey, can I get some crackers?" And you'll be like, oh yeah, let me just finish writing this paragraph that I'm writing. 10 seconds later, they'll say, are you going to get the crackers or not? Like, what am I supposed to stand here all day? Like, they'll start throwing, as they say, they'll throw shade at you, as they say. And you, because again, if you think about it this way, if they're addicted to meth, then when they're in their homes, when they're outside the hospital, if they wanted meth, they immediately start making phone calls to people to try to get meth, to try to get money, to try to go out and meet their dealer. So as soon as they need something, as soon as they want something, they just start going to get it. So when you're in the hospital, it doesn't work that way. Like, things take a few minutes to get moving. And another thing too about the addiction patients is that they are very, very regimented about the medications that they get. And a lot of times they're on pain medications for different chronic ailments and things like that. And so, like, if they're due for a pain medication at 3 o'clock, they'll start asking you about it at 2:15, 2:30, 2 o'clock, 1:30. And they'll say, I'm due at 3, but, like, can I get it now? Or, like, if it's 3:01 and they haven't gotten their pain meds yet, they will be yelling at you. So working in the addiction unit is really rewarding, but it challenges your patients to the utmost extent. Because, addicts, God love them, they want something, they want it now, and they're going to do anything they can to get their way. And another thing too, as I was saying about like the manipulation aspect, the addiction unit, you'll have a lot of times where patients will try to manipulate the staff to work for them. Because again, when you're an addict, like, you need everyone else around you sort of working for you to make your addiction continue. So when you're in the hospital and like you want food, like you want extra food, you want an extra blanket, you want extra this, you want extra that. What you're going to do is you're going to try to work the staff against each other to say, like, I just asked Jim, like, about if he can get me some stuff, but he couldn't, so can you? And like, then like next thing you know, like, they're getting 3 or 4 versions of one thing that they asked one time for, and they know that that's going to happen. So you have to, again, sort of like see through some of the static, some of the things that the messages they try to give you, and really sort of understand what their motives are, and make sure that you're working with your staff to help the patients in a way that is sort of like cohesive, to prevent patients from using the staff against each other and turning the patients against each other. Last but not least, your hospital that you might work at might have a kids unit. Now, one thing to point out here is that for most hospitals, you'll be able to specify which unit you want to work in, which population you want to work in. I hated working with the kids. I hated working with the kids because I'm just old enough to be older than the kids and to like have like gone through what they've gone through, but I'm not old enough where they look at me and see someone who knows things. So like they'll look at me and see, like, I'm like, I'm 31 years old. Like, so they'll look at me and they'll be like, yeah, I mean, if that guy was 50, maybe I'd listen to him, but he's 30, he's a loser. Forget it. Like, whatever. He's like barely twice my age. So kids, I don't know what it is, but kids just don't listen to me, and I don't blame them because, I don't know. So the few times I did work in the kids unit, like, because usually you get trained in every single unit so you know how each unit works. But the few times I worked in the kids unit, like, that was a real struggle for me because I had a hard time communicating with like teenagers. Like, I'm used to just like being blunt and being honest with people my age. I have a hard time talking to like a 15-year-old about the same issues they might have an easy time talking to a 30-year-old about. So you might have a kids unit. The kids unit might be broken up into teenagers, like 13 to 17, and there might also be like anywhere from like 6 or 7 to 13. It depends on the hospital. Some hospitals don't take anyone younger than 13. Some hospitals don't take kids at all. On the other hand, some hospitals only work with kids, and some hospitals work with kids as young as 3, 4, 5. The youngest kids I ever worked with, I think, were like 10, 11. And again, I only worked in the kids unit maybe like 5 or 6 times over the course of almost a year of working at a psychiatric hospital. And that was because I told my supervisor, I was like, look, I can work with the kids if I have to, but I don't want to. Because like in 6th grade, when you're like walking down the hallway and like you're thinking, like, is everyone looking at me? Do they like my clothes? Like, imagine that times 1,000, because like you have a room full of like 10 or 15 kids, and oftentimes kids in the psychiatric hospital, it's more so that they have behavioral issues than they have mental illnesses. Because a lot of the significant mental illnesses like schizophrenia, schizoaffective disorder, bipolar mania, those don't present symptoms until 15 years old typically, and they most typically onset between the ages of 18 and 24, and that has to do with a lot with these biological processes that occur during the teenage and early adult years are some of the processes that drive the development of schizophrenia and schizoaffective disorder. So when you're working with kids, like, you're a lot of times working with kids who are just like bad kids. Like, Their parents can't handle them anymore. They don't know like what else to do with them. They don't sit still. They constantly yell. They fight all the time. They have the attention span of a fly. So with the kids, it's so much more behavioral than it is clinical mental health. That's another reason why I didn't really like the kids unit as much. Because like I feel like I'm just constantly just like, don't do that, sit down, stop, you can't do that. Like here's why. Like and like with an adult, you can reason with an adult and say like, look, the reason that we don't allow patients to do this or do that is because it upsets other people. Like they'll understand that. Like adults will understand that, but kids, they don't care. And especially if if you look like me, the kids are gonna look at you and be like, no, I'm not listening to you. Forget it. But again, like everyone's different, and if you like working with kids, and then again, you could very well be doing that as a mental health technician. So let's talk about the positives of being a mental health technician. Being a mental health technician, you have the possibility to change people's lives, the possibility to save people's lives. And I don't mean that in the theoretical sense where it's like, oh, you helped them out of a jam and now like, you made their life better. I'm talking, you could save someone's life. You could help someone prevent themselves from killing themselves. You could help someone understand why they've been having troubles all their life. You really can make a huge impact that you really can't make in any other job in the entire industry of any field you can think of. So for example, most of the people that you work with at the psychiatric hospital, the patients that you work with, they're experiencing the worst week of their life or one of the worst weeks of their lives. And that is usually a accumulation of months, if not years, of mental health challenges and struggles that sort of culminated in a suicide attempt or in the loss of their mental capabilities. So everyone you work with is generally having the worst time of their life. It's like you think about working as like an attendant on a Carnival cruise line where everyone goes on vacations. Like everyone on the vacation is having the best time of their life, like the best week of the year. This is on the other end. Everyone you work with is having the worst week of their life, the worst week of the year. They're not happy. No one is happy. The only people who are happy are the patients who are manic and who have a really elevated mood. Like everyone else is miserable for the most part. And you have the possibility to help them, to help lift the clouds in their life, to help them to see and understand what challenges they've been facing and to help them understand how to overcome them. So you're not a therapist, you're not a licensed counselor, you're not a psychiatrist. All those things are true. But the thing is, you're there for emotional support, you're there for mental health support, for mental health education support. So there are tons of times, on a daily basis, there are tons of times where you will have a communication with someone, an interaction with someone that will make them a demonstrably happier, better person. And again, there's almost no job that you can think of where that is true. Maybe being a doctor or being a nurse, like, in a surgical unit. That's like the only other position, like job I can think of where this is like you can seriously change someone's life for the better. And that is what I most love about that job. Every day that I go home, every day that I should say every day that I did go home, because I don't work at the psychiatric hospital anymore, but every day that I would go home at the end of my day, I felt a huge sense of accomplishment. I felt more accomplishment in one day than I felt in months at other jobs I've had. So this is a constant thing. So if you want to change people's lives, if you want to walk into someone's life when they're at their lowest moment and help lift them up, then this is the job for you because you will feel so rewarded in that job. There are numerous conversations I've had with patients that have changed their lives. And I'll get into some of those a little bit later on in the video when I talk about some of the stories, like the uplifting stories that I experienced when I was working there. And it's really this like really special feeling when you have the ability to walk into someone's life, you just met them, and you can help them get through the toughest time of their life. So that's something I did not take for granted. I absolutely love that. It was like almost like a drug. Like it was like a high that you would get from helping people, and it was just amazing. So that is, I cannot stress that enough. You will feel more fulfilled in this job than any other job that you're ever going to have in your life. So let's talk about the downsides, because there are some serious downsides, and this job is not for everybody. First of all, unless you're working at a certain hospital or have a certain certification, the pay is oftentimes very low. So at the hospital that I worked at, I was getting paid $12.50 an hour to do what I was doing. And when you hear some of those sort of like the horror stories that I tell later on, a lot of you are going to be like, $12.50 an hour, that is an embarrassment. but it's just the nature of the work. I mean, look at the qualifications. You just need to have either a high school or college degree. Most times a college degree, but you know, some places will hire you if you have a high school degree and significant experience. But in addition, like you're mostly just someone there, like almost like a camp counselor on some level, where you're just observing everybody, making sure everyone's safe. Now, there's a lot more that goes into it, but on paper, that's what the job is, and that's why hospitals can afford to pay not that much. So again, I was making $12.50 an hour. That's $26,000 a year. It's not nothing, but it's not great. And considering the work that I was doing, the work that on a daily basis that I was doing, you know, I felt like I deserved more, and I think that anyone in that job would feel like they deserve more, because if you're putting any effort into the job, you deserve more than what you're making, most likely. So that's one thing, low pay. The next thing is this, and this is the very big one. This job is potentially very dangerous, and I don't say that lightly. I say that with all seriousness. Any moment you could get your head cracked open, and that's not an exaggeration. I want to make that perfectly clear. Especially if you're working in the crisis units with individuals experiencing psychosis, you, at every moment of the day, you could be one breath away from getting attacked, getting hit over the head, having to run into a dangerous situation and put yourself in harm's way. I mean, it is like, in a lot of ways, like you're like a fireman. Like there will be fires and you have to run into them and save people. I'll talk about some of those stories later on, some of the little scarier ones. But I promise I'll end on a positive note. So, last but not least, about the downsides of the job is that it is very emotionally draining. I do not want to understate this enough. It is very emotionally draining. Again, everyone you talk to, every day that you go into work, they're going to be experiencing the worst day of their lives. It's almost like you work for a funeral home, because, like, you know, if you work for a funeral home, like you'll all be just meeting like grieving family members all day. You're just meeting people who are depressed, sad. Like most people, they just tried to kill themselves, like maybe 24 hours earlier, maybe 3 hours ago. I mean, I worked with patients that were brought in where they just tried to kill themselves like 3 hours earlier. So you're gonna be working with people who are constantly in a sad, depressed state, and that can really drain on you. And going back to the aspect of the job where I was talking about how it's dangerous, the combination of always needing to be emotionally like on top of your game for other people who are not, in addition to the dangerous aspect of the job, can create long-term chronic stress for employees at the hospital. And I'm going to talk about my experience because this is something that I experienced to a very severe degree. So if you think about when you experience fear, when you experience anxiety, when you're scared, when you're afraid, the human brain, basically your amygdala in your brain, which is the part of your brain that's largely responsible for the emotional fight or flight response you experience, the amygdala starts to fire, and it triggers downstream physiological impacts in your body, such as releasing adrenaline and releasing cortisol into your blood, into your bloodstreams, into your body, to get you ready to fight or run from something. It is like the ancient man's fight or flight response, like, you know, thousands and thousands of years ago, someone walking through the savannah in Africa would see a lion, and that fight or flight response told them, like, dude, there's danger, you need to get out of there, start running away, or find something you can stab the lion with. So the problem is that on a regular basis, like in our everyday lives, we experience like the fight or flight response maybe like 5-10 times a day. Like maybe when you wake up in the morning, you walk into your living room and you're still like sort of like, you know, trying to get the sleep out of your eyes, and you see like there's clothing hanging on the wall, and it looks like someone's standing in your living room, and like your response is like, oh my god, there's someone in my apartment, and like a second or two later you realize that it's not, it's just a bunch of clothes. But that split second when you had that fight or flight response, like in that split second, like adrenaline went into your body and cortisol went into your body, and all sorts of different chemical effects happen in your body. And that's completely fine if that only happens a few times a day. Because, like, again, going back to ancient man, that probably happened 5-10 times a day on some sort of significant level. So as humans, like we humans in this day and age, we are wired to have the fight or flight response a few times a day, and that's completely fine, it's completely normal. When you're working in an environment where you're constantly potentially in danger, when you're working with an environment that's constantly needing you to be on like emotionally up, mentally up, physically up at every moment of the day, you basically have the fight or flight response dozens of times throughout the day. And what that does is eventually your body can sort of become resistant to adrenaline and resistant to the effects of the fight or flight response, to the point where you need really serious danger to even really initiate the real effects of the fight or flight response. This is basically chronic stress. This is basically combat stress. So if you think about a soldier who's like serving in like a war zone, like an occupied territory. If you want to think about like the Iraq War from 2003, where our soldiers were occupying different parts of the country, and like they were basically on duty all day, making sure that is that person dangerous? We had to secure that perimeter, and at every moment, like there's someone who might come up and like shoot them, kill them. A bomb might go off at any second. It's constant like fight or flight. You're constantly like having like the emotional like where are the dangers, what's going on. And that is why, like, police officers in high crime areas and soldiers in war zones, after several months or several years of that environment, they can eventually get what's called like combat stress, where their body is so used to the adrenaline rush that comes from their daily lives that like they're addicted to adrenaline almost. Like they're tolerant to adrenaline, and they need so much more adrenaline to get their body going. Which is why you'll sometimes see where soldiers come back from a war zone and like they start driving like 120 miles per hour on the highway. They start doing skydiving. They start like doing dangerous things, because those dangerous things are the only way that they feel alive, because their body is so drained from this constant adrenaline rush that they get. And this occurred to me on some level when I was working at the job. When I first started working at the job, I was a very calm guy. I was very laid back. There was almost nothing you could do that would get me riled up. After 6 months of working as a mental health technician at the inpatient psychiatric hospital, I reached a point where like nothing bothered me anymore, and almost like I was sort of like not like deadened to like fear and like dangerous situations, but like I needed dangerous situations to feel what I used to feel in like just like a normal situation, like an anxiety-driven situation. So my tolerance for adrenaline was so much higher, to the point where after I stopped working at the psychiatric hospital, everything seemed boring to me. And like I found myself like constantly listening to like heavy metal music and constantly moving and constantly like having to do things that were like, that would cause like a little bit of chaos, because I needed that chaos to feel on a certain level. And that was something that took me like almost about a year to really get past. It really, like the chronic stress from that job really chemically changed my mind, my brain, and my body a little bit. And it took me a long time to come down from that. Activities that I used to love doing before I started working in the psychiatric hospital seemed boring to me. They seemed like a waste of time. Like I felt little motivation to do things I used to love doing. And that comes down to chronic stress. So that's something you're going to want to keep in mind. Working in a very emotionally draining environment that is dangerous, like a psychiatric hospital, can cause you to develop chronic stress. So that means that if you do work at a psychiatric hospital, you need to consistently do things that allow you to sort of reconnect with your normal baseline, like who you were before you started working there. And you need to do things that like give yourself a break. You need to give yourself mental breaks, emotional breaks. You need to give yourself opportunities to sort of like unplug from stressors. Really consistently work on like your stress levels, meditation, things of that nature when you're away from the hospital, so that you can prevent the hospital from sort of changing who you are as a person. I know another example of how I changed when I was working at the hospital. When I first started working there, I hated restraining patients. I never wanted to touch anybody. I didn't want to be in that like dangerous situation where like someone's swinging their arms and like I have to go in there and help somebody. By the end of the time I worked there, which was about 8 months that I worked at the hospital, I actually loved restraining patients. Like I never escalated people so that I could get the restraining. Like I never did. But like when when we got a call from one unit that like another unit was having like a fight broke out and we had to go like stop people from fighting, I loved it. Like I felt alive. Like I was like, ooh, like it just got everything going, and everything else seemed so boring. And like that's one way that I saw that I changed a lot. And it's scary to me at the time, because like you hear stories about like police officers, for example, like when they first start, like they're like the do-gooder, like I just want to keep the community safe, and then like 10 years later they're like they're like hardened to human emotion, and they do things in their personal lives that like make them feel pain because they don't have any other way to feel any sort of feelings, because their bodies are so drained and their minds are so drained from the constant stress they get at work. And so I experienced that on some level. And again, I think I'm a very calm guy. I think I'm a very like emotionally and mentally in tune with myself kind of person. So if it's going to do that for me, then like, I mean, I think that any regular person, just like a randomly selected person, would have a very tough time working at the psychiatric hospital. So you need to make sure that you are doing things when you're working there that are preventing you from getting emotionally drained. That's, again, I'm just going to say that that's very important. I cannot stress that enough. So let's talk about some uplifting stories, some life-changing stories. Some times where I walked away from my work that day and I felt like I demonstrably made the world a better place. I remember like the second week I was working there, there was a young lady who was working, who was in the unit, and I was working the adult unit, and she just walked up to me with like just tears in her eyes and was like, "Hey, can I talk to you for a few minutes?" And I was like, "Oh, sure." I was like, "Let me just put some stuff down." And I walked over and sat next to her, and she started just bawling her eyes out and telling me about how when she was younger, she was sexually assaulted repeatedly by an adult that she trusted. And she told me about how her mother didn't believe her when she told her mom, and her mom basically told her she was a liar. And this woman was having like a potentially life-changing moment at that moment. She said, like, I was the first person outside of her family that she ever even told this to in her entire life. Like, she didn't even tell that to the therapist that interviewed her the day that she came to the hospital. And she finally realized, like, now is the time to open up, and she picked me to open up to. And for about 10 minutes, I had the opportunity to listen to her, to validate her experience in a way that no one else has ever validated her experience that she's spoken to before, and to give her motivation and give her encouragement that, like, yes, this occurred, but yes, you can overcome it. Yes, your life can get better, and you can start getting better right now. Start working on it right now. And whereas in the beginning of the conversation, she was crying and in obvious distress, at the end of our conversation, she had this big smile on her face. She was so happy, and she like ran to the phone to go tell her friend about how she just had a breakthrough and that, you know, she sees things differently now. I remember one specific thing that when we were talking, I said to her, I said, you know, if you were never assaulted when you were younger, if this person never did that to you, do you think that you would have tried to kill yourself the other day? And she's like, I don't think so. Like, there's nothing else in my life that I would ever. And I was like, what does that tell you? Like, that tells you that other person shouldn't have the ability to control your emotions like that. That person is not someone that should be at all, you know, coloring the way that you see the world. Like, you deserve to overcome this. You need to overcome this because you deserve to be a happy person. Like, I remember like that specific, like that moment that we had in that conversation. It was a really big moment, I think, for her. And I remember driving home that night and like feeling like a sense of like someone for more than 2 decades was walking around with this you know, this gorilla on their back, and I was able to help them lift that off of their shoulders. Like, it is, you know, like someday when I look back on my life and I say, like, what are the good things that I've done? Which I hope, you know, there have been a lot of good things, and I hope there are more. But like, that's been one of those things that stands out where like I helped someone overcome their demons, you know, and like start that process of like moving forward in their life. Like, there's very, very few times in your life where that will ever have an opportunity, where you'll have ever an opportunity to do such a thing. And, you know, this is only like the second week I was working at the psychiatric hospital, and that sort of set the tone that like, hey, this is a continuous thing. This is going to constantly happen to you, and it happened numerous other times as well. I remember another time where a middle-aged lady was having trouble with her daughter. Her daughter was just being very rude to her, and you know, the lady I was talking to, she had like numerous issues, like depression, addiction, and she was just asking me questions like, how do I talk, like, how am I supposed to do when my daughter treats me badly? And like, we and her just had like a back and forth where I was just like saying, well, what about this? Like, what occurs when this happens? Like, what kinds of things have you been doing to empower yourself? What kinds of things, like just like little simple things, like helping her to sort of get through the situation. And after we talked for like, again, 10 or 15 minutes only, because when you're working in the psychiatric hospital, you get like 5 or 10 minutes with someone, and then you have to like move on to like the next thing that's going on. And after our little conversation, like she just started crying, and she was like, no one else has ever like put this into such a simplistic way that I can understand it before. And like, I know what I need to do, and I thank you for helping me. And again, like, I just remember going home that night and thinking like, wow, like I took someone's troubles and I helped them to see them for what they are and to help them overcome them on some level. So when you're working in the psychiatric hospital, I mean, you're not gonna like if someone's suicidal and they've spent 2 decades, experiencing depression and anxiety, cognitive distortions, all sorts of like, different symptoms of mental illness, it's not like you're going to make them all go away in the week that the patient is there. That's not the case at all. But it's more so that you have the opportunity to sort of lay a foundation. Like, they're aware they have a problem. They're aware that something in their life needs to change, or else they're going to be in dead or in trouble on some level. So because of that, you have the opportunity to really take them and help them to mold themselves into who they want to be down the road. So you have the ability to sort of turn the light switch on that helps them to see themselves and see their life the way it really needs to be seen, so that they can help themselves. And that is just a tremendous opportunity. It's also a very serious responsibility that you cannot take lightly, that you cannot approach with anything less than 100% of your effort and energy. But it is something that it has made me a better person for the rest of my life. Those moments that I had, those experiences that I've had. All right, let's talk about some scary stories. Let's talk about some downsides, some more downsides of the job. So let's talk about the danger aspect of it. One night I was working in the crisis unit. I was working one-on-one with a patient who was, for the days leading up to that, he was trying to put pencils into his body in places it doesn't go. So I was assigned to work one-on-one with this person to make sure that they didn't do that. And as the patient was in his bed sleeping, and even when the person's sleeping, you need to be basically within like a certain distance of them and observing them while they're sleeping. Because if they're on one-on-one, some patients are going to be on one-on-one care, like meaning like one staff member for that patient. So when that happens, you're basically like, you're handcuffed to that patient, like hypothetically speaking, all day. Everywhere they go, you're following them, except of course to the bathroom. But so this patient was sleeping, and I was sort of just like staying in like, outside of his room, just like, just staying there. So I had a clipboard, just writing some stuff down every few minutes. And I noticed that someone was coming up from behind me. And when you're working in the psychiatric hospital, you basically learn to get eyes in the back of your head, because there are going to be people walking around you who are going to be having hallucinations and psychosis. So you're always going to need to sort of like, even when you're talking to somebody, you need to be like listening to what's going on across the room and like knowing who's behind you at the same time. And like, it's something that is a skill that you learn on the job, but it is a very, very important skill to have. So I'm staying there, and I notice him coming from behind me, and I can see him from the corner of my eye, just looking back down the hallway. And I thought, okay, he's like, they're going to walk to the other side of the hallway and just sort of walk past me, and that's it. And so I was sort of like, keeping my eye on them. And I noticed that they kept walking closer, but they weren't walking around me. They were walking towards me. And then when the person got within like a couple of feet of me, I like sort of just turned just to see like, just to sort of like look to see what they were doing. And it was a 200-pound male patient, and he started punching me in the face. And he landed about 4 or 5 punches to my face and to my head before I was able to create a distance between myself and him, and before I was able to yell enough that he finally stopped what he was doing. So again, he walked up, and I turn, and all I see is his fist coming towards me, hits me right here, and then starts throwing just haymaker combos, like to the point like my head was like a couple times like whipped around, like just like sort of like a boxer. And I ran past him, and obviously by that point, like after, it was like the whole thing lasted like 10 seconds. Like it wasn't like it was like really short, but like it was like a really significant 10 seconds. And I got by him, and then my coworkers started running because they heard the commotion. They started coming to assist, and the person just stopped. He just stopped. Like the thing is, like his eyes were so vacant, like they were just like, when someone's like afraid, like their pupils get huge. His eyes were all pupils, like it was just all black, like a shark's eyes almost. And he was obviously like almost like he didn't even know where he was or who he was or what he was doing. And I went to the back into the break room because my coworkers were like, "Hey, go in the back for a few minutes. Just let the supervisor know you were punched and stuff like that." Because every time someone hits you or another patient, you have to fill out like a big event report and all sorts of stuff like that. And I sat back in the break room, and I was just sitting there for like 10 minutes, like just like calming down. And I can feel like that there's going to be bruises all over my head and also on my face. I can just feel like the black and blue coming in, like the soreness coming in. And I was in the break room for about 10 minutes, and I went back out onto the floor, and I finished the remaining 6 hours of my shift. That is what's like to work in a psychiatric hospital. When I tell my coworkers like, oh yeah, this guy jumped me and punched me in the head a bunch of times, their response is like, oh yeah. I guess that's you finally sort of one of the group now. We've all been attacked. We've all been bitten or had something thrown at us or punched or whatever, broken the nose or something like that. So in that sense, it's working in a psychiatric hospital is unlike any job you're ever gonna have. Imagine if you're a consultant that works at a cubicle every day, and imagine that all of a sudden someone comes from behind you and starts punching you in the face. Do you think that you're ever going to want to go back to that cubicle again? Do you think that you'll ever feel safe going to that job again? Do you think that you're going to have nightmares because of that? I mean, that's going to cause so many it's like so like antithetical to every other job in the world, like getting randomly punched in the face, that like it would make you like just completely go into like a dark place about that job and about like you'd have some like lingering emotional and mental trauma from that. But when you work at a psychiatric hospital, like that's part of the job. I mean, like, some of my coworkers were like, hey, maybe you should get a CAT scan to make sure that you don't have a concussion. I'm like, if I start throwing up in a few hours, I'll know I have a concussion. I'll go to the ER. But instead, until that, I mean, what are you gonna do? It's not like when I got punched, my supervisor was like, oh, go home for the day. She was like, oh, are you okay? Okay, well then, whenever you're ready, just go back out there again. So. That's a little upsetting to think about, that you could be beaten senseless at your job. Another thing, like I've worked with people who've murdered people before. Like I've worked with patients who've murdered people before. I've worked with patients who were going from the psychiatric hospital immediately to jail afterwards for crimes they just committed. So like you get patients who are like actively homicidal and like actively don't care about you, don't care about anybody else. The one patient threw a shoe in my coworker friend's face and broke his glasses and then ran off. And when the police picked him up down the road, they brought him back to the hospital. And you want to talk about angry? I mean, this person was really angry. He got his lunch and he put, like I was talking about this earlier, but he put his apple into his sock and started swinging it around and running towards me, like trying to hit me with a sock with an apple in it. Which, if he hit me in the head, would have probably knocked me unconscious or made me feel. I mean, I have a pretty thick skull, so let's be honest, it wouldn't have knocked me unconscious, but it wouldn't have felt good. Let's put it that way. This is a regular, danger of the job. Like you will on a daily basis be close to destruction at any time. Like you're not going to get killed, but like you could get beaten up and disfigured potentially by patients. Again, it depends on the population you work with. Depends on the hospital you work at. It depends on a lot of factors, but like in general, this is a dangerous job. So be prepared for that. Another thing too is that if you're creeped out easily, you're not going to like this job. You're not going to want to be a mental health technician, and here's why. So as I was talking about with patients with hallucinations, delusions, schizophrenia, when you walk out onto the unit to start working that day, you might have a patient that keys in on you and that they'll be having delusions, and they'll start putting you into their delusions. So I've been accused of working for the FBI, the CIA, the government, and working for the military hundreds of times. And I don't mean that, I mean that literally. I've been accused of that by patients hundreds of times. Based on what you look like, based on just all different factors like that, patients who are delusional might look at you and just say they're an assassin. I always got the thing you're coming here to kill me, you're an assassin, all that kind of stuff. So I've had patients follow me around for my entire 8-hour shift and constantly accuse me of trying to kill them. I'm talking they'll follow me around, they're like, I just saw what you did. You just poisoned their food. I'm like, I didn't poison their food. I didn't put anything in their food. And they're like, you're lying. You're lying. You're trying to kill us. You're trying to kill me. I know. I'm watching you. And you'll walk across the room and they'll sit there and stare at you. And they'll watch every single step that you're taking. And they'll be like, what did you just do? What did you just put over there? What is that? What are you doing? You're trying to... They'll sit there and they'll accuse you for an entire 8-hour shift. They'll accuse you and follow you around and make you feel really uncomfortable if you are uncomfortable in that situation. So that's something also to be aware of. If you're creeped out easily, if being in an awkward situation, it gives you a lot of anxiety, this is not the job for you. And let me talk about the one time, the one and only time that I ever actually felt sort of scared in the psychiatric hospital. So patients who have schizophrenia can sometimes have what's called catatonia, which is where part of their body is held against gravity for a long time. So, for example, someone who's catatonic, like they might walk around like this for 4 or 5 straight hours. They might walk around like this the entire day because, like, it's still something that's being sort of like understood by the psychological community, but like it's part of some mental illnesses like schizophrenia where the brain just sort of compels the person to do things like that. And this is something that you see a lot in horror movies. So anyway, so there was a young adult female patient who was in the psychiatric hospital who most likely had an onset of symptoms of schizophrenia. And she was talking incoherently with really wide eyes, and she was experiencing catatonia where her arm was like this. And she was just staying there like this for, I'm talking again, for hours. Like you can't put their arm down. You can say like, hey, can you put your arm down? Like you should rest your arm. Nothing's gonna happen. So it was about 11 o'clock at night, and she was brought onto the unit, and she was just admitted. And one of my coworkers who was a nurse, she was trying to like convince her to go to sleep. Like, oh, why don't you start getting ready for bed? Again, this lady is not able to even have a conversation. She's in a very deep, mental episode. And so the patient walks into her room, and my coworker's like, hey, let's get you ready for bed, like whatever. And so my coworker patient is able to convince this young lady to lie down and basically try to get some rest. And so we left her in her room, and like everything seems okay. And she still was again with her arm up and everything like that, but she was at least like sitting down, lying down in her bed, so that's good. It was a start. Sometimes when you're working with certain mental psychiatric patients, little things like that is a big victory. Just getting them to just get prepared for bed. So then the time came around for me to do my safety check. So again, I had to go around to every room and make sure that everybody was safe, was breathing, was not hurting themselves, was not hurting other people. And I'm walking up to her room, and the door is like cracked open just a little bit, and I hear her talking in there like incoherently. Like this is what she was doing. She was talking like this, like that, nonstop. And I could see from the door was cracked open a little bit. I could see her bed. There was no one in her bed. So I'm like, okay, I have to like look in, and like I have to push the door back a little bit. And so I just knocked a little bit, and I said her name, and I was like, I'm just checking to make sure you're doing all right. And I pushed the door open a little bit, and she was standing in the middle of the room, and this is what she was doing. She was going like this. Looking right into my eyes. And again, this is the middle of the night at a psychiatric hospital. That was the only time that I was really, really creeped out, where I was just like, okay, so she's safe, and I'm gonna walk away right now. And even my coworker was like, she looked at me, she was like, that I didn't like that. And I was like, neither did I. And again, I feel for her, I feel for the patient, I feel for her. But when someone looks at you with really vacant eyes like that, it was like a primordial terror that I felt in my body. That was probably the only time I've ever like been scared in the psychiatric hospital in that way, like creeped out. And again, I should preface this by saying like in my lifetime, like, it takes a lot to disturb me. Like in my lifetime, I've been through to some very dark places. When I was a kid, I saw someone die. As I was growing up, I had numerous issues with alcohol and just different things like that. Like I've been to some dark places before, so it really takes a lot to make me have an emotional reaction to something that's occurring. But even me, like even that, I that time I was like, okay, I don't like this. This was unfortunate. And then the best part was I drove home half an hour later because it was the end of my shift, and I had to try to go to sleep. That was not fun. All I could keep seeing was her really wide eyes staring right through me almost. So that was scary stories. So let's end on a couple of funny stories, because working in a psychiatric hospital, funny things do happen from time to time. Like if you don't have a sense of humor, you're gonna not like this job, because you need to be able to find humor in dark places, because you're constantly just working with people who are in dark places. So there was one patient who was bipolar manic. And some patients who are bipolar manic, They're very energetic. They're very talkative. Like they're like the life of the party. And this guy was the life of the party. And he was like he was a fun guy. Like I just liked talking to him. He was just like a fun person. He was like just sort of like really just like interesting. Just one of the most interesting people I've ever met in my life. And I walk onto the unit one day, and he's across the room with some people patients at a table, and I'm just starting to do my safety checks and like my inspections. And he's like, hey Zach, he's like, how you doing today? I'm like, oh, I'm doing good. How you doing? Bob or whatever his name was. And he's like, hey, I really like your scrubs. And I was like, oh, thanks. Like we need to wear like hospital medical kind of scrubs. And he's like, yeah. He's like, those look pretty nice. Like he's like, where'd you get them at? And I was like, oh, I got them like at the outlets, whatever downtown. And he's like, oh, how much do they cost? And I was like, maybe like $15 for like the shirt, $15 for the pants. And he just goes, oh, do they make them for men? Like like that. And I just started cracking up, and I was like, dude, you set me up. Like, come on. Like, and then he starts laughing. Everyone starts laughing. You will have those moments in the psychiatric hospital. There are fun moments like that where everyone just has a good time. And that same patient, another funny story that he did, that same stay, in fact, where he was there that week, he had to get a shot for something, and it had to be a shot that was like a deep tissue shot. And usually, like, those are given like in the hip. And I should say the hip, like the rear end, basically. And so then he's like, okay, I'll get my shot. I'm like, I'm doing like a group discussion. Like there's like, we're all sitting in a rectangle in chairs, and all the patients in the unit, and it's me, and it's about like 10 patients, and we're all just sitting around, and we're just talking about like everyday things, like how to be nice to people, like very simple things, like just like how to become a better person, how to become happy. We just had like a worksheet that we're working off of. And so the patient was drawing up this guy's shot, and he was sitting in the corner, waiting the nurse was drawing up the shot, and he was sitting in the corner, waiting for the nurse to finish up, getting a shot ready. So the nurse comes out with a shot, and she's like, okay, whatever, let's go into your room so we can, give you the shot, and whatever, And he just, this guy, he just goes, no, give it to me here. And he runs to the middle of the discussion group, and he pulls his pants down enough so just that his rear end's hanging out, and he lies down on his stomach like a huge baby. He goes, he's like, give it to me in front of everybody. Give it to me in front of everybody. And like his little feet are kicking and stuff like that. He looked like a huge baby. And I'm just like, all right, everybody, the discussion's over. Everyone just go to your rooms right now. We'll handle this. So I mean, oh my gosh, there's sometimes where like things like that happen that are just so funny. And there's another one too, where there was like this young guy who he was more so had behavioral issues than he did like mental health issues, and he liked to be the center of attention. He liked to rile everybody up, and he liked to go against the grain. Like he was sort of like a rebel type. And we were having a discussion about how you can spot when you and someone else are having like a conflict of some kind, like how you can spot when your personalities are clashing with someone else. And so usually when we're in a group discussions, I say like, okay, was anyone having an experience where you got into a fight with somebody, and what'd you do to resolve the issue, like different like just problem solving and daily life things. And this kid raised his hand. He's like, oh yeah, he's like, so I was, dating this girl for a little while, and I was thinking to myself, oh, okay, this is good. He's playing along with like the scenario. He's not like derailing the conversation. And he's like, yeah, I was, we were dating for like 3 months, and we went to this music festival, and this guy came up to us with this big tray of gummies on it, and the gummies are different types, and I was like, can you get back to the part where you were having like a personality conflict with this person? And he's like, oh yeah, I will in a second. He's like, so the gummies, they were ecstasy, and there was a yellow gummy, and there was orange gummy, and I was like, okay, again, the ecstasy does not. This doesn't sound like it's part of the story about how you had a personality conflict. He's like, oh, I'm getting there. He's like, so the ecstasy would be different. He's like, I'm like, all right, like, we're gonna move on to someone else because you don't seem to be like, and like he had this look in his face like he knew like that I knew that like what he was trying to do, and like it wasn't funny in the moment because like I don't want him to hold the group hostage with like a drug story because like that's not what we're there to discuss. It's not what we're there to do. But like later on, I couldn't help but laugh because like I'm thinking to myself like just the way he like just like this like unabashedly was like, yeah, so the drugs I was telling you about. So Anyway, so there are funny stories. Like there are like working in the psychiatric hospital. Like it provided me with uplifting stories. It provided me with some upsetting stories, but it also provided me with tons of funny stories and just tons of just unique life experiences. So if you watch this entire video, congratulations, you made it through. And if you're watching this entire thing, it means you probably really do want to be a mental health technician. So you should consider, looking into jobs in your area if that's something you want to get into. I think that it'll be a rewarding experience if that's something that you're looking to do. If you're attracted to the field, if you're attracted to that kind of work, then you're going to enjoy the work. And again, just make sure that you're aware of the different considerations I talk about in this video before you go in ahead of time. And if you really want to make an impact in people's lives, then go for it. Otherwise, if you have any questions, by all means, leave them in the message board below. I like to respond to everyone's feedback, everyone's questions. If you have anything that you want to add about maybe if you worked in the field, maybe if you were a patient in a psychiatric hospital, by all means, please leave some comments below. We can have a little discussion about those things and learn from each other. It's always fun. So anyways, thanks for watching, and I hope you guys have a great day.